Over the past few months, I've noticed a number of comments all expressing something similar, with that being the idea that tutors, cards that search a player's library, are in some way out of place within the landscape of casual EDH, or at least within the landscape of lower power levels. In particular, I've encountered this when I discuss cards that are quite powerful compared to everything else in a deck. I've at times brought up the scenario of a powerful card being an obvious tutoring target, sometimes in a way I find uninteresting, and a common response I get is, well, why are you playing a tutor then? That's your problem right there. On an objective level, this person isn't wrong. The tutor is part of the immediate problem here, and I wouldn't be having an obvious card to grab if I wasn't grabbing anything in the first place. However, there are some deeper disagreements taking place here, disagreements about the foundations of EDH and what it stands for. So, in this video, I want to explore those disagreements, and to discuss the nature of variance, variation, and luck, and what role these things should play within a game of EDH. Different players will have different ideas of how much of these things should be present in a game of Commander, and these opinions are often phrased as proclamations about what falls within the spirit of the format. So, what does this phrase mean? Well, the best way to dig into this is to look at the way EDH differs from other Magic formats. Decks are 99 or 98 cards, significantly more than the 60 seen in traditional constructed formats and the 40 seen in limited decks. EDH also has a 1-copy limit on cards within decks, as compared to the 4-card limit for 60-card formats, and together these restrictions make it so that for any given card, a deck will often be around a sixth as likely to draw it in an EDH deck as compared to a 60-card deck. This fact alone has led many people to make the observation that EDH is a higher variance format than other formats. For the non-mathy folks, the word variance sounds a lot like the word variation, and that's actually not an incorrect way to think about some of the implications of these numerical realities. Because there are more different cards, each with a lower average chance to get drawn, there will be more variation in the cards that get played within a game and between different games. As a result of this, decks will generally feel new and fresh for longer, and play patterns within a game are often less predictable. All of this is great as far as I'm concerned. Recently, I've had a strong interest in decks containing lots of sub-themes that can combine in all sorts of ways. The challenge of optimizing and tuning a deck like this to actually play well is a blast, and it's a blast that could only exist in a format like EDH. Within this sort of synergy machine deck, tutors can be a helpful tool to help an otherwise disjointed deck actually play nicely, but excluding tutors can likewise be a fun challenge that forces an even greater degree of deck cohesion. Some people choose to play the EDH format at a power level that demands a greater degree of consistency in cards available, but a high degree of card and play variation is absolutely an enjoyable thing to cultivate where possible. All of this sounds good and agreeable, but something you may have noticed is that this pedestrian interpretation of the phrase variance has strayed pretty far from the sort of scenario I mentioned at the start of this video. I'm not talking about whether you'd use a tutor to find any old card. No, I'm talking about situations when a player uses a tutor to find some piece of degenerate nonsense, a card that will dramatically impact how powerfully their deck plays. To tackle that question, we need to talk about variance in the mathematical sense, and we need to talk about it in terms of how it applies to power level. The power level variance of a deck basically refers to how widely a deck's power level differs moment to moment and game to game. This is difficult to track exactly, and obviously in a multiplayer format like Commander, a deck's moment-to-moment power level won't always directly translate into wins or losses. But most people are going to have an intuitive idea of what I'm talking about. When a deck is progressing effectively toward goals that will lead to winning a game, it's having a more powerful game. If a deck has access to a powerful card like Soul Ring or Skull Clamp, it's going to be having a better time on average than if it had access to Mind Stone or Rogue's Gloves. If you take nothing else away from this video, understand that a game with a lot of card variation is different from a game with a lot of power level variance. You can have one without the other, and a defense of one of these things isn't necessarily a defense of the other. When it's already a foregone conclusion that a powerful card is going to exist in your deck, the question of whether to run tutors for it then becomes the question of whether you'd prefer to have that powerful card frequently or infrequently. On a probabilistic level, the deck that runs the tutors will be more powerful than the deck that does not. Let's say we're using a 7-point power scale. That's a fun number. If drawing into a particular power card naturally leads to a 6-power game, tutoring it leads to a 5-power game due to the extra cost and or inconvenience of the tutor, and not having the card leads to a 3-power game, the expected power of the deck that runs tutors will be higher than the deck that does not. If you're figuring out what power level games to play the deck in, and you're a certified math dork running the odds, you could say, well, the expected power level of the tutor version is 4.1, and the expected power level of the non-tutor version is 3.3, and then this could determine the decks you choose to play this deck against. Problem is, both of these decks are going to have that power level 6 game 10% of the time. It's just that one set of opponents is going to be a bit better prepared for that situation than the others. This abstract approach demonstrates the core of the issue, with decks having a higher degree of power level variance, but that abstractness makes it a bit less helpful in understanding real-world cards, because different powerful cards accomplish very different tasks. So let's talk about some real-world Magic cards. For starters, let's talk about the quintessential card in this sort of discussion, Sol Ring. I've been jokingly calling this card my Wizards of the Coast mandated dose of variance whenever I draw it for the past several months, and it truly is a massive injection of variance. It's one of the most powerful cards in the game, indisputably the most powerful mana rock in the format after the banning of Mana Crypt, and it's been printed in every precon out there. So this should be an example of the great woes inflicted by power level variance, right? Well, not exactly, and this is where things get a bit more nuanced. Sol Ring is powerful, but its power is somewhat less felt than a lot of other cards, and this is for a few reasons. First of all, it only provides mana. If you don't have good things to do with this mana, it's not going to be all that powerful. Decks still have Commanders, a bonus card they can cast at any time, so it's rarely useless, but it might only be modestly powerful in some circumstances. Secondly, it's a low-cost card. 1 mana for a rock that taps for 2 colorless mana is insanely powerful, yes, but that power falls off rapidly, and drawing it past turn 5 or so might not even be that desirable. Thirdly, it's a card that is typically far back in the progression of winning a game. If we think about a deck as having a pipeline that runs from the start of the game to the hypothetical point at which it wins, Sol Ring falls right near the beginning of that pipeline. Since Commander is a multiplayer format, this will often give opponents a lot of time to collaborate in slowing down the Sol Ringing player, negating some of the power level bump of the card. Now, does all of this mean that Sol Ring's power is something that never feels bad? Absolutely not. The most problematic instances of Sol Ring tend to be where there was already a bit of power level imbalance between decks, and especially if some of the weaker players kept poor hands or had unlucky openings. Sol Ring can be an equalizing tool for the weakest players, but it can also be drawn by the person piloting the most powerful deck, boosting what might have been a workable game into an outright pub stomp. Calls to ban Sol Ring, or now to put it on the Game Changers list, exist for a reason. The card is far from the bane of the format's existence, but it's also not a perfectly unproblematic tool, and that makes it a good place to start. Following the pipeline model, what falls on the opposite end of the line? Well, it's ways to win the game, typically ones that are near instantaneous, such as combos or combo-adjacent cards. These tend to lead to the most jarring instances of power level variance because the table doesn't have much time to react. You go from playing the game to having it end without enough time for any sort of table-coordinated response. I'll elaborate more on why this sort of thing constitutes a problem in a bit, but naturally when there is a problem, a card that wins the game immediately will be the problem-iest. Incidentally, this pipeline model also makes it clear that removal can be a tool for power level variance mitigation on the scale of a game. Between Sol Ring and cards that outright win the game will be a bunch of cards somewhere in the realm of what might be considered an engine. The engines that only provide card advantage will typically be closer to Sol Ring in terms of their position on the pipeline. Card advantage is quite good, yes, but it can take a little while to fully pay off into a win, since mana will still be a limitation. The One Ring can feel quite powerful, but the table should still have a decent bit of time to work together and stop a one-ringing player if they start to get out of hand. The engines that are further down the pipeline are the ones that grant mana in some form as well. Think something like Bolas' Citadel or Arcane Bombardment. When one of these hits the board, the table might be a single turn cycle away from fully losing control of the game, or even less in some cases. So this is the 4-point model I like to go with. You've got your early game stuff that is more of a temporary boost than anything. You've got your mid-game engines that can start to push out of control if given time. You've got your late-game engines that signal an imminent threat to your opponents. And you've got your truly game-ending cards at the very end here. Obviously, these are categories I've defined with specific sorts of cards, but it's possible to categorize basically every proactive Magic card into one of these based on how imminently they threaten opponents in a game where they might be considered powerful. And that's the key here. The utility of these categories is in analyzing a card that already seems like a possible power level outlier of sorts. Power level variance will be felt more sharply the further along this pipeline a card is, due to the social nature of the EDH format. As I mentioned earlier, a Soul Ring is quite possible to play around, and typically only an out-of-control power spike in very specific scenarios when there were other factors lining up at the same time. By contrast, there are all sorts of scenarios where a Craterhoof Behemoth or a Mizzix Mastery might feel like a shocking or unsatisfying turn of events. And fundamentally, that's my broader problem with power level variance as well. The wider a deck's play patterns span in their power, the more difficult it is to put together good matchups, and the less satisfying games will be. Let's think about a mid-power Raccoon deck. We're doing a bit of ramping, playing some Raccoons, and then maybe throwing down some cool top-end spells once we've built up our mana. But now, let's say the deck contains a Godo Helm combo in it that can instantly win the game if the Godo is drawn and the deck has enough mana. Or, heck, maybe even just a few especially strong top-end creatures. What power level of game do you play this deck in? You could play it alongside other flavorful mid-power decks, but you might randomly smash them with an out-of-character power play. Alternatively, you could play with other decks that have some higher caliber plays, but then you might just get destroyed when you only draw into a bunch of Fair Magic Raccoon friends. When decks have such a high degree of power level variance, it's hard to find a fair game to play them in, and if you choose your game based on the fair 80% of the time game plan, the other people at the table may be in for a rude awakening when you draw the 20%. In addition, even if you find a table that seems suitable enough for the deck, this degree of randomness is destructive to a lot of the things that make Commander a great format to me. One of the most important elements of the format is its multiplayer feature. You're playing alongside 3 other people, and games often require strategizing and performing threat analysis, figuring out the best way to navigate the landscape in front of you. The issue with decks that have a high power level variance, then, is that they make threat assessment almost impossible. There is no landscape if you're playing against a bunch of decks that do a mixture of power plays and dirtling around with vague synergies accomplishing very little. You could target down the person who currently has the most threatening thing on board. Maybe this is where some people like to stop with their threat assessment, but you can't ask yourself, what will these decks be doing later? Do I have any sort of clock I need to worry about from this player, like some sort of combo game plan they're assembling? Or will this other player get ahead with overwhelming value if they aren't pressured now? This information is unknowable if the power of a deck's game plan is determined by raw chance, and the end result is that Commander turns into a luck game. It's seeing who draws the powerful stuff, and who puts it together at the right time, and who happens to have the exact answer available at the exact right time. To some players, this is likely fine, good even. Commander is a very diverse format with lots of people looking for lots of different things out of it. You're allowed to enjoy the more luck-based version of Magic, where concepts like strategy and threat assessment are reduced down to a shadow of their usual selves, but you should at least be able to understand why if other people don't want to play a Commander game somewhere along the lines of wizard-flavored Yahtzee or dragon-themed bingo. Obviously, I have strong personal feelings about what degree of power level variance I find fun in a game, but rather than spending too much time berating you with that, I think it's worth asking another question. Why do so many people end up with decks that might be considered higher variance? Some of it is likely intentional, but a lot of it comes down to the nature of the EDH format and the culture that has developed around it. EDH is naturally a format where plays need to be larger in scale, and this is for 2 simple reasons. Life totals are doubled, and there are 2 extra opponents. Naturally then, it's common to see a lot more cards that are synergistic. They rely on other cards for some of their power. This is not in and of itself a bad thing, and a well thought out synergy package can make for a fantastic backbone of a deck. However, when packages are narrower, and when they don't tie together as well, and when decks go overboard on certain types of payoff, problems can arise. It's pretty common to see decks with lots of cards that are only good when the deck is in a specific situation, like having an ideal board state, having specific types of support, being ahead in some way, and so on. This is common to see because humans are bad at thinking about chance. Let's say you have a little micro package with 6 enabler cards and 4 payoff cards for a particular thing. What are the odds that these actually show up together in the top 15 cards of your library? The answer is probably lower than you think. There's a 64% chance you'll have one of the enablers, a 49% chance you'll have one of the payoffs, and a 30% chance you'll have both. This means you'll have a large amount of time where one or the other of these is a dead card unless they're well integrated into the rest of your deck. And that's not even considering whether or not you have the mana to cast these things. Take that into account and you're probably south of 25% of the time. Long story short, humans are exceptionally bad at thinking about the probability of multiple things lining up just right at the same time. For a little analogy, this is why sports betting apps make a killing on parlays, bets on multiple specific things within a game happening. People make these bets because the payouts are higher, but in reality, the probability of multiple things happening at the same time is typically low enough that these bets end up having massive margins for the apps, even with the higher payout. Taking things back to deck building, this fact of probability means that if you run a bunch of cards that are mainly only good alongside other cards, or mainly only good when you're already in a decent situation, you're going to end up with a high variance deck, and not in a way that I'd find fun personally. You'll have some games where cards show up together at just the right time and you're able to take over the game, and other games where things don't come together right and you end up puttering around on the sidelines while more consistent decks are able to actually play the game. And this is to say nothing of the relationship these decks have with removal. A deck that hinges on being ahead, on having a specific situation be the case, even simply on having its commander stick around long term, well, that's a deck that's going to have a rough time against an opponent who has the interaction to keep it in check. If an opponent has seen your deck performing well, and if performing well means absolutely going ham on the board, they're going to try and slow you down. If your deck also putters around doing nothing when it has a key piece removed, well, you've just set yourself up for a 1-2 punch of not having fun. You might also call this sort of deck a feast or famine deck. When it's able to do its thing, it dominates whatever game it's in, but when certain key pieces are kept off the board, either by bad luck or opposing interaction, the rest of the deck's cards aren't able to do much of anything. Another thing that contributes to a high degree of power level variance within EDH is that people feel more willing to put especially powerful cards in decks when those cards work with their commander in some way. You'll certainly occasionally see people who will toss powerful infinite combos like Heliod Ballista or Dualcaster Twinflame in any old deck they can cram it into, but it's much more common to see people throw in cards that combo with their commander. In my video on the subject of turning commanders into a combo piece, I bring up that large percentages of both Zexara players and Tivit players play one-card infinite combos with their respective commanders. This isn't great when it occurs in a deck that is mostly winning in decidedly mid-power fair magic sorts of ways, such as sacrificing clues with a Disciple of Vault in play or swinging in with a handful of normal-sized Hydras. This is true for the reason I mentioned earlier, turning games into a strategy-devoid swingy luckfest, but also because it can impact the threat assessment of your opponents, causing you to attract extra hate even when you're playing with the decidedly fair magic half of your deck. So, why do people choose to make this sort of deck-building choice? On some level, the existence of these power cards probably feels like a gift. The sort of play that would feel out of place in a deck is rendered acceptable to people due to it tying in with their commander or a major theme in their deck. It is, as I would jokingly say about Sol Ring, a prescribed dose of variance that has been handed down by the abstract godlike figure that is Wizards of the Coast. The same goes for cards that are more in the realm of engines. I gave a couple more minor examples of this in a recent video, Waste Not in a discard deck and Monument to Endurance in a cycling deck, but there are numerous examples of commanders or archetypes with one specific mid-game card that goes absolutely crazy. Skullclamp with tokens, Thrumming Stone in a Shadowborn Apostle deck, Colossus Hammer in an Ardennes deck, and so on. However, I want to focus on one in particular as an illustrative example, Krark's Thumb in a Usuri deck. Usuri is a commander that flips up to 5 coins when he attacks, most people choose 5, and his controller then draws a card for each heads and takes 2 damage for each tails. If 5 heads are hit, you get a temporary omniscience. Spells are free to cast until end of turn. On its face, this is a spicy commander. If we do the math, this is basically a creature with 2.5 double damage Phyrexian Arena stapled to it, and which also gives a roughly 3% chance of an omniscience turn. What happens to these numbers when a Krark's Thumb is played, a card run in 91% of Usuri decks? Well, the impact of improving the coin flipping odds is pretty dramatic with 5 coins flipped per turn. Average cards drawn per turn goes up from 2.5 to 3.75, average damage taken goes down from 5 to 2.5, and this means that the average damage per card gets cut down by a full 2/3. Even more dramatically, the odds of an Omniscience turn are almost 8-fold improved, now sitting at just below a 24% chance. And that's an Omniscience on a turn where 5 extra cards were drawn. It's not hard to imagine situations where the game is won either right then and there, or rapidly thereafter, even reasonably early in the game. I don't think you need me to tell you that this card constitutes an almost absurd degree of power enhancement for a Yusri deck when played. So, is this a reasonable variance spike? Is it good for a deck's commander to normally be a potent yet painful draw engine, and in a much smaller number of cases become a much more powerful draw engine without the risk and with a 1/4 chance each turn of offering a quite possibly game-winning benefit? I don't necessarily want to answer that question for you. In part because it's more complicated than something like an infinite combo, and also in part because Yusri is a commander that already selects for players who are looking for a somewhat luck-based experience, so I'm probably not going to be convincing that person that this is any sort of negative thing, even if I wanted to stake out that position. I'm merely bringing attention to this as an example of EDH culture in a nutshell. The fact that a full 91% of players are running Krark's Thumb demonstrates the universality of this sort of good cards are a gift mentality, even in a casual format. It's also at this point that I want to turn things back around to the question of tutors. Here's a question. Is it better if a Yusri player runs tutors to find the Krark's Thumb, or is it better if they allow Lady Luck to run her course and bring them the thumb when she deems it appropriate? I think a lot of people are going to naturally default to the no tutors option there, but why is that? If you're going to be playing powerful stuff, isn't it better to have it more consistently and also give your opponents the chance to strategize, to consider their options, to weigh the risks of different plays? Is it better that they play against a janky coin flipping deck that occasionally throws on the gas randomly and then 24% of the time has that gas turn into rocket fuel? You can feel however you like about those questions, and I think it's entirely reasonable to have some mixed feelings about this sort of thing. However, this example does start to clarify the impact of tutors on power level variance, particularly in a deck containing more powerful cards. If you're playing a deck with a handful of power cards amidst a number of worse cards, running tutors to improve your chances of drawing said power cards will lead to less swinginess, since you have access to the power card with some degree of consistency rather than only in a handful of games. However, this usage of tutors is naturally sacrificing deck variation. You're going to be making more similar plays every game. This can still be cool if you're running a sort of secret commander deck, where you're able to build off the consistently tutored card in a variety of different ways, as you might do with a commander, but this is likely a minority of cases. This brings me to a second and somewhat stranger usage of tutors. Tutors can help you in the process of identifying cards that might be out of place in terms of their power level variance. To build off a real-world example, I recently heard a content creator discuss an experience they had that caused them to cut the tutors from one of their decks. They had tutors in their Vela the Nightclad deck, and they found that all too often they would tutor for Rite of Replication, a card that can copy Vela 5 times and deal 30 damage to each opponent. This is a one-card combo that will instantly win the game in many situations, if a very mana-intensive one. The Vela player found this a bit boring after a while, and the response to this was to cut the tutors. But when I heard this, my first thought was, wow, think about the gift your tutors just gave you. Like, these tutors have identified a card that is exceptional enough to be the correct tutoring choice most of the time, and have also given you the chance to decide that that exceptionality feels a bit off, and in the process have given you the chance to indulge a bit and play the card a few final times. Put in more general terms, tutors let you see what cards you're gravitating toward, and they also give you extra opportunities to decide how you feel about a card. If you're tutoring for a card a lot, you can ask yourself, have I been enjoying having this card more often? If the answer is yes, great, all is well. If the answer is no, well, that gives you the opportunity to make some choices. It might be that the card is out of place in your deck, but it also might be that the card represents a game plan that was fun for a bit, but that you've already gotten your full amount of enjoyment out of for the moment. In either case, you now have the opportunity to try something new instead of that card. In my most tutor-intensive deck, my Shroom Slide deck, I'm always performing exactly this sort of analysis. There's obviously the part of the deck pertaining to the flicker enchantments, and I never get tired of those since they're what the deck is built around. But my artifact fetching wizards give me the opportunity to see what I tutor for, and which of those things feels satisfying when played a lot. The only cards I find myself tutoring for first every time are Soul Ring and Fluctuator, and both of these are fine since Soul Ring is just mana advantage and Fluctuator is a core card I can play around. On the other end of things, Portal to Phyrexia is a powerful card I was worried I'd be tutoring for too often with my Treasure Mage, but that really hasn't been the case. There are just so many useful top-end artifacts in the deck between win cons, removal of various types, life gain, and other utility cards. In fact, Portal hasn't even been my most common target for Treasure Mage. That honor goes to Angel of the Ruins, though even then I'd say that's only my pick about 30 to 40% of the time. Part of the joy of a toolbox deck is the action of figuring out the right tool for the job, and balancing tutor targets so that they all get the chance to be the correct pick across different situations is a great way to optimize the fun of a deck like this. This act also naturally smooths out the power level of different cards, making for a more consistent experience with my draws in addition to my tutoring. Ultimately, whether or not you add tutors to a deck is a personal decision, and I'm not really trying to sway you one way or the other on that. I presented these 4 quadrants in my last video to illustrate 4 different philosophies on whether to tutor for a powerful card, and returning to them now can illustrate how deck building decisions play out. In a deck with a handful of more powerful cards, including tutors will likely reduce the power level variance of the deck and lead to a smoother game-to-game experience. But it will also likely have the side effect of reducing card and play variation, making the deck more samey. This puts a deck in the first quadrant. Not including tutors will do the opposite. Decks will have a greater variety of plays game to game, but they may have sudden power level spikes here or there when a powerful card is drawn. This puts a deck in the third quadrant here. The fourth quadrant is one where most cards that might spike a deck's power level are weeded out, but tutors are still included. This is a generally low power level variance style of deck, and the play variance of this sort of deck really depends on its pilot and how it's built. Some people might value getting different cards each time and combining them in different and creative ways, whereas others might look for a more consistent play pattern with less variety. A final fifth category might be a deck that combines neither any major power outliers nor any tutors, and this sort of deck would likely be both high variation and low power level variance. Ultimately, the biggest thing I want to get across here is that these two things are separate knobs. The tutor conflict within the casual EDH community isn't a battle between people who want different things every game and people who want the same experience every game, nor is it a fight between skill havers and luck enjoyers, nor a duel between good players and bad players, nor a skirmish between pub stompers and fun havers. There will be elements from some of these dialectical clashes present, but also a lot of other things, including some I mentioned in my last video. However you choose to build your decks, the best I can hope for is that the framework I've laid out over the past half hour might be helpful in the goal of building something fun. Thanks for watching, and I have an announcement. It is a deck building challenge based on a Tumblr post my brother sent me a while back. The rules are simple. Submit a deck with no E's in any of the card names. Submissions can be made on my Discord server until this coming Thursday, end of the day. You should also include a approximately 100-word story or poem, also containing no E's. I'll be highlighting a handful of decks in my next video. With that out of the way, thanks to Archidekt for supporting the channel. Archidekt is my deck building site of choice, and it has lots of great tools for analyzing your deck and seeing the likelihood of drawing cards from different categories, which can help with managing variance. I'd also like to thank my patrons for their support. I produce one bonus video every month only for patrons, and I'll be including a preview of this month's bonus video right now. As an experienced Magic player, I find Commander's mulligan rules very forgiving. I find that I rarely get mana screwed in a deck where I am building it in a way where I'm, focused on not getting mana screwed. I will build decks where I am leveraging mulligans hard, and in those cases you will have kind of the off games where some issues happen, but I can build a deck where I'm never going to get mana screwed most of the time. Like, there will obviously be like the 1 in 100 games where I have to mulligan down to 4. But, I think for the most part, it's possible to build mana bases where you aren't going to have problems. Free mulligans followed by a London mulligan is just pretty forgiving. Now, if you're a newer player, I'm also not judging that at all. But I find, this sort of comment very funny when this person clearly knows that them running a low land count and them not using normal mulligan rules, these things are clearly tied together, and yet they still write the comment. I don't know. I find it funny.